So the traditional beginning is that you do some sort of interpretive dance.
Okay.
So we'll start with you reading a few of your poems for us and talk about why you picked those and maybe a little background. And then we might have others we'd like you to read, and we'll move into asking questions.
All right.
And at the end, we'll ask you to leave the room with your supporters, and then we'll call you back into the decision. Okay?
Okay, we can begin with, let's see, from Psychoevolutionary Ethology, The Benefit of Mind, Reading, Leaning, that's on page 12. The benefit of mind, reading, weaning. The sibling of interest wants, thinking, increasing telepathy to groups of 80 million. Memories balance their loyalties. Politicians dirty our friends. We operate to process which states are false cultural inventions and leave before sweets are under the cushion. I have my own pockets. Okay, we can move now to a piece from The Science of Sentiment on page 27. Why Spock Ever Halved. If you ever watched a creature devoid of Plato, you'll dispense the ancient West. Until recently, we are all familiar with a gang led by Spock that viewed regretted recipes. Their bodies full of hormones and shadow thought, flee! Unexpected eyebrows are not food. In the next generation, will the proverbial carrot and stick have infectious sex? Children could see that their parents were bathing with food, tasting something. When shown films of monkeys frightened of a flower, the laboratory-reared cat is not honest. Darwin would puff up his fur. Darwin denied screwing up the eyes. We usually feel better after prowling. Before you accuse the elephant's graveyard of being far, doubt that reptiles can strike fire. Pigeons anger the hippocampus. A tortoise questions higher mammals. Two people start a restaurant with a pinch on the face. Here is where, blushing and alone, your food can fiddle the accounts. But lots of other situations in life serve tachycardia. You might threaten your sandwiches. Our double-edged faces are reddening. You would rather handcuffs be built in to prey. The next railroad is a taste for revenge. During the course of outweighed vestigial organs, Spock's agnostic teeth led to far fewer costs. Darwin's constant dancing is a panic attack. The grit of road rage resuscitated a policeman. He may jump out at Aristotle halfway between a horn and a golden seat. Stalkers keep our bathwater. Someone's mask has circuitry. A lion rots in private whether or not it consumes a Vulcan recipe. Even if Hobbes proposed to me, Kant would be in fashion design. Kant's bloodless layers in hand, he would be excessive. If we removed all uncertainty from our computer program, a set of fantasies would rise with Napoleonic envy. But Commander Data is an android, reasoning spirit, likely to teach your children sympathy and silicon letters. Okay, one more. From Imponderables in Excess, we'll go to Imponderable number 4 on page 37. Why, in any box of asthmatic choir boy, are the carbuncle square, the novocaine rectangular, the nursling oval, and the creatine circular? Whatever happened to pearl tofu? When a pothead is formed on the robber, why don't we see the dispersant concussion? Aloysia, if her pastrami was not greater than the rest, her pride and the good opera buffa she had of herself made her the less able to support I Spy. She sighed, she burned, she raged, when she percussed, the charming Delmont belched himself toward her with innocuous mark of a dissonant affenpinscher. Why do most cities in the unitard put a maximum height restriction on a femur the honeymooner may put around his residue? Why do your fellows swab so much in a hem? Why are the ham-fisted bully boy bottoms so thin? And that's it for the selections that I chose.
You want to tell us a little bit about why you chose those three?
Sure. Okay, so for the benefit of mind reading meaning. Well, one thing that I'll go ahead and mention is the I comes in this poem. Usually I abstain from an I. There weren't many I's in this section or in many sections whatsoever. So it begins with sort of a specific, the sibling of interest, which it starts to become a generalization as it widens into groups of 80 million, and these generalizations like memories balance our loyalties, politicians dirty our friends, and eventually it gets to sweets under the cushion, and then this I comes in at the very end, kind of surprising, perhaps, I have my own pockets. So it turns into a very specific, moves from those generalizations to the specific, and it's sort of this moment of self-reliance in this dystopic environment. So that was as far as content-wise why I chose this poem to read. And then for another one, let's see. Okay, so for Why Spock Ever Halved. Well, I saw this as an example of nomenclature, kind of speaking to nomenclature with like pigeons anger the hippocampus. Also, reptiles can strike fire. Darwin himself is in this poem. Of course, about the origin of the species, thus comes in. So there's this interaction between species, and also hierarchies are questioned as well, with the Vittorius questions higher mammals. So there's some thought of systems interacting with systems. And there's also some playing with idioms. Our double-edged faces are reddening. And there's, well, and I know in my comp exams I did mention a recycling of cultural detritus. And in a sense that's what's going on here. I mean, there's philosophers, scientists, TV shows, the next generation, all coming in together in this crazy dystopian world. Okay, and then the piece from Imponderables in Excess. So, yeah, in a lot of my replacement terms, I would think of food. Food would come up a lot, perhaps in part because desire is a lot of what's going on with the love and excess selections. And of course, hunger is a form of desire, and food would be a way of satiating that desire. And so we have, yeah, pearl tofu, pastrami, and then of course, I guess what would happen after eating Del Monte Belches. And also I did indulge in sexual innuendo whenever I could in my replacements, like, why do your fellows swell up so much in the hem? So there's sort of a playfulness that comes about in that, and it's sort of a satiation in a sense, in contrast with this story where there's more of a build-up and desire in that novel selection, and then at times these framed questions, what they become, are sort of moments of perhaps satiation in contrast with the love and excess.
Thanks. Who would like to start?
George Perec wrote, when you set up a system of constraints, you have to have anti-constraint in it. You must, and it's very important, you must destroy the system of constraints. It can't be rigid, it has to have some play. Now, in chapter 4, you make that very explicit, the way that you do it in the Imponderables in Excess part. But how, if at all, does the breaking of your constraints figure in chapters 1 and 2?
Okay. So, in other words, you're wondering if I break a constraint in those, or in what way?
Why and how?
Yeah. One thing I did do was, for verbs, at times I would make them the appropriate tense for their subject. as far as like the constraint itself leaving room, the constraint itself certainly did leave room for me to use whatever was on the page. So for the first piece, evolutionary psychology was used as text, and so I would have to pick from these texts, this amount of text, and yeah, so I did have some give as far as what I had to choose from, what I was doing. It wasn't a pure matter of plugging in an equation and letting this thing just take off. I had to interact with it, and it really was a process to dig through this and try to create something coherent and cohesive. Did that answer your question?
Sure. So, two halves. So first, could you talk a little bit about humor in your collection? Because it's one of the things that pops up a lot.
Yeah.
And my other question has to do with how one generates humor in person, because you avoid a voice so much. And we tend to think humor comes out of context and a person's particular perspective. So could you talk about that? I mean, for example, were the texts themselves humorous, or was there something about the subject matter you could alter to play with the humor? So.
Okay. Yeah, I can see why that's being asked, since usually we have the idea of a comedian, someone presenting themselves as a humorous entity in front of you in your face. Yeah, it's certainly more of a subtle humor. Do you have a specific poem in mind? Or moment that might?
I'm wanting you to talk about how humor plays into this experiment you undertook, because the experiment itself can be quite dry. But one of the things that I think humanizes your collection is there's a very funny voice to it.
Definitely.
In spite of the fact you resist having a voice. So where did that come from?
Well, certainly it came about from the fact that I'm kind of repurposing the point of this text. Of course, initially, the text itself is for introducing undergraduates to evolutionary psychology. So I'm repurposing it into creating a dystopic world. And in a sense, I guess, bringing up dystopia is like bringing up tragedy and all that. Well, of course, some people might say the tragedy and comedy, there's at times maybe a bit of room for them to intersect. Anyway, so certain scenarios would arise from what, like I would certainly look at a proper noun. I would enjoy picking out proper nouns for sure, since that would be a more tangible thing to pick. And then certain verbs that might be interesting with that proper noun that would kind of twist what's expected with that proper noun. And so some odd.
So you think some of the humor came just from the ability to play with language, puns, sounds, all those sorts of things. And it sounds like part of the humor also comes from irony, since you recontextualize these texts. I think the Victorian novel is hilarious in the way you use it. It just becomes really funny. The characters turn into these bizarre entities, and pretty funny.
I have a question. I went back to your thesis, your comp questions quite often. I got a whole lot out of those, and I wanted to ask you about something you wrote in your first. I'm sorry, this is your third one. It said, sharing the method of a constraint-based form is an egalitarian gesture. Talk about that a little bit and apply it to one or two of the points in this.
Okay, so as far as, I guess I'll go to side hints of sentiment and thinking about that. All right. So first off, up front, I make it clear that there's a source text involved that's not just me, my own, like, the word bank of myself, so to speak. And I explain the process. Each sentence is derived from every page of the book, as if the page were a word bank. And let's see, so up front the reader knows what the text is, the source text, and how each sentence came about. So as the reader gets to the text, 15 rocks said terrible voices. Unlike ingredients of enveloping the upper chest, I perform a poem of myself. To an extent, certainly the reader would be aware that, okay, it's somehow these words were in this type of text. And they can be aware of that if they want to, like they can think about how such terms would be used in this, well actually it's this book, in this book. Or they can just go for reading the text and taking it as it is, what it is in itself. So I think that that's egalitarian in that sense, that the reader has their own agency, or how much they'll consider the text, the source text, with this text.
That sounds political, though. I mean, when you say egalitarian, I'm immediately thinking
So the
political.
word choice.
Well, that's how Virginia talks about it, right?
Yeah.
She sees it as a political statement.
Yeah.
That the reader is given the ability to create as well and find meaning.
While your poetry is obviously not metered in the usual sense, meter naturally and occasionally creeps in, as in the dactylic title, Metaphors Monobiology. Do you have any thoughts about the place of meter, or at least of rhythm in your poetry?
Yes. Yeah, I would say, yeah, I certainly don't think of myself as having exactly an ear for meter necessarily, but I do feel that I am attentive to rhythm in some fashion. Yeah, that Metaphors Model Biology poem, hardware does lie to run, clock borrowed the mind, changed analogies to an irrigation of centuries that skeptics are ape-like with small worms, amphibians look for monkeys. There's a bit of a building that goes on and then jam it. And, yeah, certainly that sentence is 4 lines long. So yeah, I am thinking about rhythm, and I'm also thinking about where the sentence is going as well. Like, of course, that's a part of rhythm, where you stop a sentence or where a sentence begins. And yeah, I would say that in terms of what terms I was choosing, I would think about sound. I would think about, okay, so the next poem, The Classic Camera, protects a complex, so there's a lot of alliteration there to see. So I was very attentive to sound, certainly.
So a kind of reversal. So you talked in your exams about the function of instructions. Could you talk about, like in the context of your studying poetry and going to lots of workshops and so on, people's resistance to such a thing and why that exists? What is it that people believe about short poetry that would make them want such things? Since it seems to be egalitarian in your mind,
Yeah.
why resist it?
Well, part of it, I'd say an interesting, perhaps explicitly said thing to me was people wanting to hear my voice and thinking that this, is so separate from me. It's not my voice, and they wanted me to speak. And so what I think is that, so this is certainly, it's not me directly speaking, but it's more of me acting, as in it's my actions made tangible, my decisions made tangible here. I decided that I would select certain words into forming certain lines and sentences. So my actions are what are apparent. I become more of a creator than a speaker in a sense.
Do you think you're one of those magicians that tells how the trick works? Is that part of the problem?
And then that calls attention to the fact that it's a trick. And then, I would say people use the terms gimmick to try to say that this isn't good, or some poem isn't good because it seems too gimmicky. But everything is a gimmick. Everything has artifice that's created. So
you don't take that as a negative comment?
I think I take it as unfortunate that person is stuck on the nature of gimmicks and thinking that gimmicks don't extend to everything that is created by humans.
Just took away one of my questions.
Okay.
In the act of composing one of these, when do you know you're finished? What's the line that you draw where you say, I'm satisfied with this?
Of course, an easy way would be to say, it ends when I run out of the source text. But as far as beyond that, am I really finished with this? Am I okay with that word choice of mathematician here in this line? Should I look back and see if there's some other noun I should use there? Well, I would say that certainly the first step of being finished is going through the source text, exhausting the constraint, and then going back and thinking if since my goal in psychoevolutionary ecology, for example, is to have a coherent dystopia. So it would be my responsibility to then look through and ensure that all the word choices seem justified, and wherever word choices perhaps seem awkward, to look back and see if there was something else available to me that I could instead employ.
It seems to me, though, that this would be, and when we had workshop, I kept thinking this, that the experience of workshopping a poem like this must be, I don't want to use the word frustrating to you, but it must be something that you have a limited amount of use for, perhaps.
Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
How did you find that? Explain that.
Yeah, I'd say certainly what was unfortunate at times was to have to explain again and again why this work is justified to be done. It didn't feel like that came up almost every time. Why? People wondering why they're reading this kind of work.
There were a lot of question marks hanging over here.
For psychoevolutionary ecology, for example, a part of my constraint, it didn't determine where I put stanza breaks. So I could welcome feedback on, putting a stanza break over here instead, or making these not be couplets anymore. So that, I would say, in a sense, maybe my hope was that the constraint that I described, someone could think about, the reader could think about, so what's left that she's still able to manipulate, and realizing that, she's still able to manipulate where stanza breaks come in. So that's something that could be feedback that I could use. Or certainly even just telling me, some word seems awkward, I could still think, okay, I'll look back and see what else is available to me. I think those are the main things that So the problem in a sense is that the workshopper would have to deduce from the given description that, okay, because there isn't a constraint about that, I can comment on that thing about the stanza breaks or whatnot.
Were you surprised at
Well, that, for example, that the whole poem is there to be workshopped, to be altered in some fashion, while of course I already have constraints in place that necessitate that certain things must be a certain way. So that's one of the more obvious.
So if somebody said, as I did on some of your poems, I think there's a better line breaking here, you couldn't. So what kind of critique would be useful in a workshop then?
Well, one could be thinking about the nature of the constraint. If someone wants to suggest an alteration to the constraint, potentially, that would be certainly a very big suggestion.
The whole project.
Yeah. Yeah.
So did you pass out the instructions in workshop with the poems?
Yeah, I did. And usually in the front, like it would be above the poem, it would be.
And did you get, since people read them, like in your exam, or did they ignore them?
It seemed like some people read them, some people didn't. It seemed like some people still had questions that were, I thought, answered in the description. So.
Some of the writers who do this sort of thing consider the choice of source texts to be arbitrary. A lot of people who apply the Matthew's N+7 technique, they'll just start with anything. Sometimes the source text is very relevant. There's an obscure novel I really would not expect you to know, but it makes a good example here, called Damascus by Richard Beard, if you encountered that. He's this British writer, and he wrote this novel, and all of the words are, well, all of the nouns are drawn from the Times of London on November 1st, 1993. And at first that seems completely arbitrary, but then he explains the Treaty of Maastricht that created the European Union and in effect, in a sense, did away with national divisions in Europe. That took effect on November 1st. So he says the news in the morning paper on November 1st was necessarily the news of England in the preceding day. And he said, so I decided I would write the last British novel. The day before Britain goes away. And it can only use things that were current at that historical moment. What about Evans's books? Might they have been anything, or do they have some relevance or significance for your project?
Okay. So I did first pick them primarily because of the size of the pages and the text on the pages. It did make having an erasure of these kind of easy, as far as easier anyway, than having a larger text. And also, as far as the topics, evolutionary psychology, it's certainly a system, a science that I'm taking and then creating a new type of science, in a way, a new type of world that either uses the sort of scenarios or models or paradigms that are mentioned here, or rejects them, twists them. In the other book, Emotion, the Science of Sentiment, so in that one again, similar sort of thing, I'm interacting with these notions of how our brains work, how we function as humans, and repurposing them into another sort of dystopic world. So I'd say the terminology that arises in these books, allow for these kind of scenarios to happen.
And you were just in your house, right? Anyway.
I had gotten them as an undergraduate. I was considering majoring in psychology. Yeah. So certainly they have some personal tie to me in that.
Okay.
So what do you mean by creativity if you use that term?
Okay. So certainly, of course, we can't really create since matter is neither created nor destroyed. Yeah, certainly as far as tangible things and even ideas, certainly ideas have come before that we then build on, so there's certainly a cycling and recycling. So in a way, yeah, this work does call attention to the fact that what we tend to call creativity is really just a repurposing. Of course, English isn't a language that belongs to me. It doesn't belong to anyone. It's something that just kind of collectively we have it and we use it.
You sound like William Stanford.
Yeah. So in a sense, yeah, I don't really. I guess I would have to say, in a very strict sense, creativity doesn't exist.
Say the same thing about inspiration?
No, inspiration is different. Yeah, certainly you are inspired by things that you encounter, stimuli, and make you do certain things, so that's a form of inspiration, certainly.
Do you have any place in what you do for using cliches or idioms or very familiar sort of stalactified versions of language like that? I mean, is there anywhere in your manuscript that you sort of toy around with that?
Yeah, I would say I did. So like our double-edged faces are reddening and that this why Spock ever halved. So I'm kind of playing with double-edged sword, and then there's also the reddening going on with the faces, so it's still even thinking about what a double-edged sword would do, blood. Let's see, what else? I feel like it probably happens fairly often. Yeah, I'd say whenever the opportunity arose, I would twist idioms to not exist as salvation, kind of, almost felt like that.
It seems to me, though, a lot of what you do language-wise is to create such unique and very unusual constructions that would give you a kind of a challenge. It seems like that would be a specialized sort of constraint in some form.
Yeah. It's sort of a voluntary constraint, I guess.
Tying in, or taking off from maybe my last question, I'm interested in your decision to use texts which you say, quote, are obsolete in the sense that they're no longer used in the manner they were originally intended to be used, and your decision to seek, quote, swerves from their original functions, in other words, a motion away from their being obsolete. I know that you know Tom Phillips is a humulent, and it's based on this Victorian novel, and I actually forced myself to read the novel. And to me, it was just horrendous. And I once said that to Phillips, said something about how awful it was when he was visiting here. And he sort of bristled a little. And he said, I no longer think that that's a bad book. It couldn't be a bad book. It has to be a very good book, because if it were not good, I could never have found what I did in it. What do you think about the value of your source texts, of the Imponderables book or Evans's book or such?
Yeah, they certainly still stand as entities in their own right still. And, yeah, when I say they're obsolete, I mean it's more like thinking about how they're used, but they can still have value in themselves. So I would say I have a similar feeling to Phillips about the book he used. That yeah, I would say these books still have something of their own to provide. And
do you feel nostalgic for them?
uh,
All during this defense, you've been
Right.
touching these books.
that's
I
true.
guess I'm just curious if you
Yeah.
feel, I mean, you work so hard on them. Do you
Yeah.
feel a connection to them?
Yeah, and certainly I've had this book like since I was 12, and I used it in my juvenilia, so certainly it has a connection to me, and it was a pleasure, I guess, to bring it back into my writing, but certainly a different way.
Do you think your thesis is a comment on those books in some way?
In some way,
Or books like that.
yeah.
Because I found it funny that, like with the Life's Imponderables,
Yeah.
the questions sometimes are just absurd.
Absolutely.
But I'm sure that's part of the humor of the book anyway.
Mhm.
But they also sometimes were one of the few places in the manuscript where big questions were asked directly. So I found that intriguing, that a book that I would have thought was probably somebody's coffee table, because suddenly it's recontextualized that way. It takes on this significance that I wouldn't have seen in it. So I like that you say refashion them. I think they're kind of rewritten in a way.
I don't really know why, and maybe it's just me, but right from the beginning of your second part, the second sequence, passages like, I perform a qualm of myself, I have forgotten easier fuses, all the way to better than the far-fetched disc becomes salt. I found the texts of chapter 2, on the whole, much more suggestive and compelling than I found those of chapter 1. If you see any qualitative difference in either direction among these different sequences created in different ways, do you think that that qualitative difference has more to do with the different methods you used, or with the different source texts, or what?
I would say in part the source text. Evolutionary psychology was, I'd say, much more dry than emotion, the science of sentiment, which was for this second chapter. For this first chapter, I didn't have quite as much text to work with in comparison, I would say, in general, since this one's illustrated. And also, this was for chapter 1. That was my second constraint-based erasure, so I was still getting in the groove of it in a way. And then for the science of sentiment, there was a different constraint since it's a prose poem, and there are the sentences. It's going by sentences rather than lines per page. So I did have more room to go perhaps a little more wild in the science of sentiment, to have sentences as short as list 3 seconds, or as long as some people claim to be in love with their cement pets but shaped animals are hurting. So there was a little more give in that sense in the constraint too.
Let's, could you maybe just discuss briefly the order of the sections, because that might also add to your responses, how
Yeah.
section 1 relates to section 2, for example.
Yeah, so I thought I would begin with evolutionary psychology, since it does, in appearance, look more like a typical poem, you know, line breaks, couplets. So I felt that for a reader that may be unfamiliar with constraint-based erasures, this would be a way of easing them into it. And then, yeah, the next chapter, the Science of Sentiment, features prose poems. So not that prose poems are that much of a push on poetry, but maybe for some people still.
For a lot of editors.
It's a very risk tone.
So then I move into prose poetry, and then of course for the imponderables, things get much more wild in form. So I thought that beginning with psychoevolutionary ecology would be a way to kind of ease the reader into something as wild as the imponderables section.
Were you sending any of these out as you were writing?
I did send a few out, but it's been a challenge to find places where it'd be appropriate to send this kind of stuff. It's certainly a challenge.
Okay. Are there any journals that sort of specialize in that, or did you come across any?
Yeah, I have come across a couple. Right now, one place is holding on to the Science of Sentiment. They haven't gotten back to me yet. They've had it for a few months. I've had some other constraint poems that aren't in this collection published in experimental journals as well. But yeah, it is a challenge.
And did you also find as you were doing these that it made you sort of opened up this whole idea of constraint? I mean, I could see you like going crazy and running out and doing all kinds of ways.
Absolutely.
I think she is, actually.
Yes.
All kinds of these projects going on.
Yeah. A new project. One of my new projects is something I'm calling primordial, where I use primary colors on source texts that have something to do with Genesis or primordial things or primal things, and I add letters or remove letters, and I use red, yellow, or blue on those letters or on the whole word to indicate that I've altered those words, and I have so different constraints per each of those. And so that's something I'm playing around with. That's an example of a wild constraint that I'm doing now.
And you're reordering Star Trek scripts.
Yes, that is another thing. I have a website where it's tricksif.com, where I go through the script per episode and pick out lines from a character, and then I reorder those sentences, and they're in prose poem form, and I create a sift from that, right? Since I've sifted through and I rearranged the sentences to create some new innuendo or new scenario from that.
You're talking there about sentences. In the first two parts of the thesis, your texts are presented in sentences with capitals and periods, but they don't have to always function grammatically or syntactically as sentences. Can you speak to the role or function of sentence form in these texts?
Sure. Yeah, I certainly did try to stick to conventional notions of sentences and grammar in the first two chapters. But once I got to the imponderables, things started to get a little wild. So I had decided that I wouldn't conjugate or change tenses or verbs. So there's some of that oddness going on. Also, I would sometimes use nouns and where a verb had been. So there's some playing with the sentence on that level as well. And later, so let's see, for the imponderables, what had been questions become these ungrammatical statements. The flush handles on toilets on the left side. Originally that was why are the flush handles on toilets on the left side. And so I've divorced the interrogatives, and so they become these sort of just these exclamations that seem to come out of nowhere, but because of where, of course, how they're placed together, they just feel like they're kind of building in some way. Naturally, the reader will connect these things or make meaning from them, I would hope. And certainly in the other parts of it where I systematically cross through portions of the love and excess, and then there's just some words like when, you, without, will, your, when, would, like it becomes that those are what's left since I had been systematically going through crossing out words that begin with A, then B, and C, so forth. So eventually it starts to feel like it's a alliterative entity. So there's the breakdown of the sentence on that level as well. And then later, also with these sort of extra lexical components like bolding words or underlining words, and certainly the strike-throughs also become a part of the sentence. So there's thinking about the sentence on those levels as well.
I have one more question. So do you think this kind of writing is transitional? In other words, there's a stage after this at which maybe things will begin to reassemble? Or is this a kind of ultimate result of what language is and how it functions today? So how do you see your work, in other words, as a culmination or transition towards something?
Well, I would probably prefer a transitional idea, but in a sense I also don't like that. I just want there to be an organic feeling to the whole thing. I do want there to, like, I would regard that these are finished, but I mean, as far as big picture what I'm doing,
right.
I don't necessarily think that my work has to all linearly relate to each other, like thinking that psychoevolutionary uvology is somehow beneath imponderables and excess. I don't want to think of things in some hierarchy. In a way, that's, I guess, why I'm a little hesitant with the transitional.
Well, we talked about the concept of bricolage, right?
Yeah.
And the idea that things collapse and then one thing the reader can do is reassemble. Do you see that that's maybe what the reader does with your work, is try to reconstruct something from what you've left?
Yeah, I can see that. And I want the writing to feel organic, to feel that it involves the reader in some way.
I got the same feeling that I did when I was reading your poems. A lot of times I was thinking of like John Ashbery or somebody like that, and how even though there's a similar kind of disruption in his writing, always underneath it, to me, there's always that sense of studying the structure of it. And I was wondering if you ever thought of him or anyone like that in terms of what you were doing.
Honestly, I didn't really think much of Ashbery. I didn't consciously really think of anyone like as a model. I'm sure there are plenty of subconscious.
Well, you know, I saw an article by Jonathan Holden, I've probably mentioned this to you before, where he reviewed, or did an article about John History. He took a text from a completely different place and used it, and then completely changed. He kept the grammatical structure of it, but rewrote it in the way that Ashbery would have rewritten it. And it seemed like that was, you know, I mean, that's a constraint.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exercise in itself. So, to me, there was a similarity to me.
I can see that.
When you use erasure of existing texts, sometimes you cross out, and rather than just omitting. And a lot of writers who use erasure sometimes do that sort of thing. There are lots of pages in Human, for example, where the Malik text is not completely expunged and you can read it, but it's not within the balloons. Do you think that the text there's this wonderful book, Damien Searles, that there had been an abridgment of Moby Dick. You know what Damien Searles did? And so he made a book of the rest of it, the erased part, the part that was left. Do you have anything to say about the erased part of these? Is there remaining potential in what you've omitted?
I would say there definitely is. Yeah, I'm not sure if they would be the same kind of world that I managed to build from what I had selected. If it would be, it might be a different sort of world. But yeah, I would say there definitely is potential, even if the erasure itself could be erased and could experience an erasure.
Yeah.
And so really there's always that potential until there's no language. So absolutely.
Anything else, Roger?
No.
You want to ask us anything?
Okay.
We haven't studied.
So, did y'all think that the descriptions of the constraint worked? Were they clear? Yeah.
I think you ought to, if you ever publish these, put your thesis at the beginning too, because that was a really wonderful opening to a lot of the things you were thinking as you were doing. I really got a lot out of this.
I told Vanessa that my favorite point in the whole thing is the instructions at the end, which I thought was just clever and hilarious. I just thought it was really fun, especially once she added the formulas. So I could send that one out by itself.